Hello friends, welcome to the Smart Student channel. My name is Chelsea Seaburn if we haven't met before, and today we're going to continue on our quest of covering all the different types of references that fall under APA 7th edition. But today I want to talk about the odd ones. The odd ones out, the oddballs. What might those be? Those are your citations that don't fall under your traditional categories like a book would, or a journal, or a web page, something you find online, things that I'm listing on the screen right now. These are what I want to show you how to format, because while they're very similar to every type of reference list entry you're going to create, they all vary a little bit. And I also know how nice it is to have that verification of someone telling you exactly what you're supposed to do, aka the bread and butter of my YouTube channel. Okay, so first things first, odd citation or not, all reference list entries are made up of the same 4 elements. If you've been with me for a while, you probably have these burned into your brain at this point, but I'm going to cover them quickly for those of you that are new. So those 4 elements that you're always going to look for is going to be the author, the date, the title, and the source, in that order. Now, because we're talking about odd citations, I want to point out a few things about these elements. When it comes to the author element, that simply means the creator of whatever type of source you're trying to cite. So this could be the editor, the photographer, the speaker, the presenter, whoever created that source that you're trying to cite is considered the author. The date is self-explanatory. The title is always going to be the title of the work you're trying to reference, and then the source will always be where you could locate that reference. So if someone's reading your paper and they want to look up where you found this information, that's where the source information is going to go. But with that little bit of understanding, let's go ahead and jump into the example portion, because I find that's where the magic happens. That's where you really understand what I'm talking about. So here we go. And hello, welcome to my laptop. So to kick off these examples, let me explain what you're looking at. So first things first, highlighted in yellow is going to be the type of source that we're referencing. Then what I've done is I've created a template of what that odd citation should contain. And so if you'll note, the reference list template is color-coded based on those 4 elements I covered just a second ago. Then underneath, I've created an example that applies that template, as well as an in-text citation to wrap it up nice and neatly. But now let's go ahead and get started, and I'm going to zoom in here because I know how hard it is to see these from afar. Anyways, the first type of odd citation I want to talk about is a personal communication. And if you're not familiar with what a personal communication is, it's simply a source that you want to include in your paper that doesn't contain a source. In other words, there's nowhere for the reader to look it up if they wanted to. So the criteria for a personal communication is, well, you're not going to include that reference list entry, because the purpose of a reference list entry is to give the reader the option to look up the source. Instead, you're going to include an in-text citation. And so I'm going to say right now, as a rule of thumb, if you do want to include a personal communication in your paper, please know that that does not count towards your reference list entries. You can absolutely use the information if it enhances your paper, but it does not count as a formalized reference. But some examples of a personal communication would be things like an email, maybe a text message, a personal interview, or perhaps a live speech that's not uploaded online, maybe an unrecorded classroom lecture, or even a recorded lecture, but it's not anywhere online that you could link into your reference list entry. You might include a memo, a letter, so on and so forth. The list is endless. Again, there's no source. But now let's look at the template for that in-text citation, because it differs from your traditional in-text citation just a little. So you still want to include the author element to start, but here you want to go ahead and include not just the author's last name, but if you have that first initial, go ahead and include it there. Then, if you'll note, the word personal communication is included in the in-text citation. And then lastly, you have the date. And again, the date varies just a little, simply meaning that if you can find more than the year, go ahead and put the full date that's available. So in this example, you can see exactly when this personal communication was posted down to the day, in which that's what I'm going to include. But now let's go ahead and move on to those odd citation examples that do require reference list entries. And mind you, we have quite a few examples to go over, but I am going to note that my explanations are going to get shorter and shorter because while they're all different, you're going to see a lot of the same thing. But let's go ahead and start with a press release. And so a press release falls under the category of what APA calls gray literature. Think of things like reports where they don't fall into a traditional category of a book, a journal article. However, they're still relevant to academic writing. So for the press release, what you're going to do is include the author element as normal. You want to include the full date element, the title of the gray literature, in this case, the title of the press release, and then note how you want to include a description in square brackets. And that description, if you look down here at the example, is simply going to be press release because that's the type of source you're citing. If this were a report, you would include report for the description. Very simple. Then, if you'll note, the source element isn't very different from a traditional reference list entry in that you want to include the name of the source it came from and the DOI or URL. But this one actually makes a good point. That's kind of an umbrella general rule of thumb, and that is if you're citing a source that uses a group author. So this group author is what we're using for the author element, and then if we were to click on this, the group author is also the name of the source. So coming back here to the example, if you'll note, you would not repeat the author element and the source element if they're the same thing. So that's just a little refresher to referencing 101. But then lastly, go ahead and take a look at the in-text citation. Here we have the traditional author element, which in this case is a group author, and then the year of publication. But now let's go ahead and move on to our next example of an embedded video. And I'm going to say right now, an embedded video is going to be the most different out of all the odd citations we're going to cover today because of what an embedded video is. So an embedded video is a video that is originally published on one source and then included, aka embedded, on another source. And so that alone is why they're different because essentially you need to pay respects to both sources. But let's go ahead and look at the template and then it'll make a little more sense. So for the author element, APA wants you to look for the username or screen name, which again is just a fancy way of asking who originally created this video. Next, for the date, all you need to find is the year the video was originally posted. Moving on to the title of the video, this is self-explanatory. It's the title of what the video is called. And then again, you need to include a description of this source in square brackets, which quite frankly should always be embedded video. Now, it's the source element where things get a little wonky. So this is where you need to attribute both of those sources. So you want to start by including the upload date, and this is going to be the original upload date. So here we have the 2nd of February. Then you need to include the words available at followed by a colon and a live URL. So if I wanted to look up the embedded video, I could. Lastly, you need to finish off the source with an access date. So as you can see down here, I accessed this video on the 20th of July 2020, and I'm going to include a comma right there to make it correct. The last thing I want to point out here is that you do include a period after the access date. But now, moving down here to the in-text citation, please note that I've included both dates here. One for the video when it was published, and then 2 when I accessed it. You always want to do that anytime you have 2 years in your reference list entry. But let's go ahead and move on to the next example, which is a discussion post. This is a source that I have a lot of students ask me how to cite, so I'm happy to give you this example. But let's go ahead and go through the template. As always, you want to include the author element, the date element. For the title element, you have the title of the discussion thread, then a description, which should always be discussion post if that's what you're citing. Then the source element should be formatted like you see it is here, meaning that you want to start with the phrase discussion posted in, the name of your university, followed by Blackboard, followed by a comma, then the name of your course, followed by a period, and then ending with the URL to complete this reference list entry. So looking down here at the example, we have the author, the date, here is the title of the discussion thread, with discussion post in those square brackets for the description. Then for the source, we have discussion posted in Walden University Blackboard, comma, English Composition 1, period, and here's the live URL. But now let's take a look at the webinar example. And you know what? I'm actually going to include webinar or lecture here. But basically, you have a recorded speech somewhere online. This is traditionally where you're trying to cite a lecture or a webinar, say your professor gave it, it's uploaded on your university, and you want to cite that information in your paper. So here we have the author element, and in this case, you're looking for the presenter of the webinar or lecture. You have the date element. For the title, you want to include the title of the webinar, then the description in the square brackets, followed by the source location in either the DOI or URL. So this is starting to look more like our traditional reference list entries. And so coming down here to the example, this one has two presenters, so it's following reference list formatting principles for citing studies with two authors. Then you have the date, you have the title of the webinar right here. For the description, this is a webinar. If this were a lecture, you would type out lecture in those square brackets instead. And then for the source location, this is found on Royal Roads University. And of course, we have the URL right here. And if you'll take a look at the in-text citation, again, general in-text citation. However, note that there are the two authors included because there's two authors in the reference list entry. But now let's take a look at a conference session. And this is going to be fairly similar to a webinar or a lecture, but the source is going to be a little different. So again, you're looking for the presenter's information. You then have the date element, and please note how the S is included in this one in case the conference spans a few days as opposed to one day. Then you have the title of the contribution. And the reason the word contribution is included here is because the conference session could be a spoken conference. It could be a conference where you're looking at it on a poster. It could be a presentation, a PowerPoint. There's a few different variations of the type of conference, and so that's what that means. And then same, in the square brackets, you want to include the type of contribution. So that's another way of saying what is the description for this source. But now, taking a look at the source element, you want to include the conference name as well as the location. And of course, the URL if it's applicable. So let's go ahead and take a look at the example. Here we have three different presenters. Excellent. Next, we have the date element, and again, this is what it would look like if the conference spanned more than one day. So as you can see here, it was from July 12th through 15th. Got that? We have the title of the contribution, and in this case, the type is going to be a conference session, so that's what we're going to include in the square brackets. Then from there, we have the conference name, which is the Autism Society National Conference, and here is the location that the conference was held. Lastly, you have the URL to finish out this reference list entry. Then coming down here to the in-text citation, again, note how we've included all three presenters because that's what's contained in our reference list entry. By the way, if you have any questions at all about what I'm discussing in this video, don't hesitate to drop those in the comment section below because I know we're covering a lot of ground. But now what I want to talk about is dissertations and master thesis papers because it can either be published or not published. This first one is an example of not published. So let's go ahead and start with that. I'm actually going to zoom back in so we can see the finer details. The first thing you want to look for is the author who wrote the paper. Then you want to include the year the paper was published. Then you want to include either the title of the dissertation or the title of the thesis. And then for the description element, note that you're going to either use the phrase unpublished doctoral dissertation or unpublished master's thesis. For the source, you're simply going to include the name of the institution awarding the degree. Since it's not published, there's not going to be a URL or a DOI link, which is why the institution or the university is completely acceptable for the source. So here we go. Let's look at the example. You have the author, the date, we have the title, and in this case, it's an unpublished doctoral dissertation. That's what we're going to include in those square brackets. And this doctoral dissertation comes from the University of Virginia, which is what we're going to include for our source. Simple enough, right? Now let's talk about if that dissertation or thesis paper was published. So the first two elements are the same. You're looking for the author of the paper, the year the paper was published. Again, you want to include the title of either the dissertation or the master's thesis. But now in the description section in those square brackets, things get a little bit different. So first, you want to signify if either it is a doctoral dissertation or a master's thesis, and then that's where you're going to include the name of the institution or university awarding the degree. Because for the source, you want to include the name of the database or the archive name, as well as the URL of where you can find it. So coming down here to the example, we have the author, the date, the title, and in those square brackets, this is signifying that this is a doctoral dissertation that came from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Here, this is showing us the dissertation is located in ProQuest and in Thesis Global. Since this dissertation is located in two different places, you don't want to include two URLs. What you would do is you would go to, say, ProQuest, and you would search for it using that title. But you guys are troopers. Let's move on to our last two examples for our odd citation tutorial, starting with a data set. And so I'm going to say right away that this one follows very traditional reference list entry principles in that you have the author of the data set, the year the data set was published, the title of the data set. You're going to include a description of the data set, which is probably data set. If this were a different type and you wanted to distinguish between it, you could include that here as well. But then you have the name of the publisher and the DOI or URL. So like I said, very traditional reference list entry here, and here is the example to demonstrate it. But lastly, let's talk about PowerPoint slides or lecture notes. So here we go. All right. You have the author or the creator of either the PowerPoint or the lecture, the date information, the title of the presentation. You want to include a description to decipher what type of source this is. So in this example, as you can see, it's a PowerPoint slide. You want to include the source information. And so the reason it says source information is because the type of source will vary depending on if it's a PowerPoint, a lecture, so on and so forth. And so as you can see here, this is located at Canvas at FNU. And then lastly, we have the URL to close out the entire reference list entry. And then I just wanted to point out the in-text citation for this one as well, because I always like to include at least one example of a direct quote in-text citation in these tutorials. So let's say that you wanted to directly quote the exact words that you found on one of those PowerPoints. You can. The way you would do it is include the author, the year, and then you want to signify which slide that quote was located on. In other words, you want to include the source locator if you're directly quoting your source. All right, friends, if you're still here right now, thank you for hanging out with me through this whole video. By the way, if I didn't cover one of your references or sources that you're trying to reference, please know that you can search my YouTube channel. This month, I have created so many videos on the different types of reference list entries you can create from the various sources, so there's a good chance that I've already covered that one. And by any chance that you don't find it, comment down below on this video. I love to help out people who support my channel, so there's a good chance that I'll actually respond to you, or I will put it in a future video. But with no further ado, that's going to be all for today. Be sure to give this video a big thumbs up, share it with your friends, and of course, subscribe for more videos like this every week. Thanks, guys!